Good evening, students. Tonight we're going to talk about Chapter 8, International Disaster Management. So if you think about what we've talked about so far this semester, we've talked about disaster management as it pertains to local, state, and federal responses, risk management procedures, aftermath, post disaster. So now we're going to look at it on an international level. So, what is our responsibilities to other countries in the world that are dealing with natural disasters? How do we deal with, again, the response? First we deal with the risk management. Then we deal with the response to a disaster, and then the post disaster. How do we deal with those infrastructures and other countries as associated with the world? We look at it as being the leader of the free world, us being the United States, that we take responsibility in helping other nations and countries around the world deal with their natural disasters. So we don't live in a fishbowl. We live in a society from around the world. So how do we respond to some of those natural disasters? Who do we deal with in the third world countries? If you look at the United States and you haven't gone outside the world to see some of these third world countries in Central America, South America, look at what's taking place in Brazil at this point. The cartels and the gangs have taken over South America and Mexico, Central America, where people are fleeing. How do we deal with those type of, they're not natural disasters, they're man-made disasters, dealing with war. Think about what when we started bombing Iraq, now that we have caused basically a disaster in capturing Saddam Hussein. Now, how do we rebuild Iraq to let the country get back into being a country free to have democracy? And how do we deal with the infighting? There's two sects in Iraq that was fighting over the leadership. When we killed Saddam Hussein, there was a power vacuum. And how do we put the people in charge that we want to run the country? So those are a lot of factors, not just natural disasters, but factors that we cause. When I say we, the United States, along with the United Nations, and we go in and we deal with some of the terrorist organizations. How do we deal with that aftermath? So, it's been taking place throughout the country, throughout the world for centuries. Think about World War One, World War Two, Poland. When the Nazis, we eradicated the Nazis from Germany. We bombed and bombed and bombed each other back and forth in France. How do we help them rebuild post-war? What are our responsibilities to those disasters that we've caused, along with the natural disasters that take place in those countries? What do we do with the coordination? What about the sovereignty of the state, meaning the state being who's in control of that country at this time? If you look at what's taking place currently, I love to talk about current events. What's currently taking place in Israel, where the bombing between Palestine and Israel is taking place, and they're bombing each other. How do we coordinate relief efforts to Israel and other countries that are dealing with bombing? So we currently look at a governing body surrounding some of these areas. We call it the United Nations. We all know what the United Nations is. I don't think we need to go into all that. But it was established in 1945, and 51 countries at this time are in the United Nations. And we have a representative on the United Nations along with other countries, and it's a group that sits down of leaders that talk about increasing public awareness of these disasters, obtaining commitment to whatever disaster that we're looking at. We look at enhancing scientific research on causes of natural disasters and the effects of natural hazards and environmental disasters in society. I remember years ago, we were on this greenhouse gas emissions in the United States, and we have been on a massive decline in fossil fuel emissions for the past 20 years. But in China, they're building 12 coal plants a month to handle their infrastructure problems and their electrical issues. So we're now looking at these other countries saying, okay, we've done it. What are you doing to eliminate some of these disasters that are going to take place in the future down the road? The United Nations has an office that deals with risk reduction. They coordinate efforts among countries to reduce risk. Just as we talked about in this country, we do that through codes enforcement, through education, and things like that. We look at the potential mortality rates of some of these disasters, economic losses, critical infrastructure. What we want to get is international cooperation. And then we look for early warning signs and how to disseminate some of that risk information. Again, we talked about the disaster in India, where a tsunami went in and killed over 100,000 people. I think it was 200,000 people that we talked about earlier. They weren't set up with morgues. They were having mass cremations. We didn't know where to put all these people that had perished. Now, how do we get back in and deal with the infrastructures? And the United States went in to help India in dealing, not only the United States, I should say the United Nations, went in to help deal with the natural disasters that took place in India. We talk about our coordination with humanitarian efforts. You think about Africa, we still have people starving. We still have poor water system, poor sewage systems, poor food systems in those countries. How do we go in and build those countries up? We still have tribes in Africa that are killing each other at an exponential rate, still taking place, although it's not in the news every day. It is taking place every day, the execution of people, the mutilation of females. So we go in, and the United Nations acts in those instances as a law enforcement. We go in and patrol with the United Nations and to stop some of these killings that are taking place in these third world countries. There's still massive amounts of problems in Africa. How do we get aid to them? How do we provide them food and shelter when they're being burned out of their homes and they're basically homeless? How do we go in and teach and get them back into farming and raising their own foods? That's all part of the United Nations peacekeeping efforts, as well as getting the people back into a stable government to where they're not being persecuted. We talk about search and rescue groups. How do we coordinate those? How do we coordinate the services, tools and services to get people in there to build that infrastructure? Remember, in these third world countries, they don't have the technology that we have to send a truck out and put power lines back up. They just don't have that technology. How do we deal with the economics and the social affairs uh, worldwide to address this issue. How do we stop the mass immigration from Central America to Mexico, across Mexico, and to the southern border of the United States? How many people do we legally take in every year uh, as part of a humanitarian effort? We are still a rule of law. We are still a country of laws, and we still have immigration policies that must follow. Currently at the border, they're throwing children over the border. And once they hit the American soil, it's our job to take care of those children. Although people see it as inhumane being in a captive environment or a holding environment, we're not only holding them, we're protecting them, we're feeding them. And if you look at the countries that they come from, it's a huge improvement from where it is. The world food programs that we're in. There is the International Red Cross. They come in and take care of some of those medical, food, and shelter and clothing issues. The International Red Cross. There's the National World Health Organization, better known as the WHO, that obviously is investigating the whereabouts. Sorry, not the whereabouts. The original COVID-19 vaccination. COVID-19 pandemic. Where did that start? We know it started in China. How did it get exposed to people, and then how did it get into the world? And we saw it very quickly travel throughout the world. So we use the National WHO organization, World Health Organization, to keep an eye on some of those pandemic issues. If you remember years ago, we had a scare of, it came out of Africa. Oh, I'm drawing a blank. I've been in the car for 10 hours driving to the beach and back today. I just drew a blank. A very deadly virus that some of our healthcare workers in Africa were getting. And for the life of me, I drew a blank. I'll think of it later, and I'll come back to that. So preparing those countries for those disasters and allowing them to deal with that. How do we deal with climate change, health, migration, inclusion? How do we deal with all that from a international standpoint? We use organizations like the United Nations military forces, which includes the U.S. military, in relief efforts to try to get those supplies out around the world. Our military is one of the biggest law enforcement agencies in the world. If you think about it, we go in with NATO and we patrol some of those third world countries to keep peace, along with keeping those rebuilding efforts moving forward. Remember, we are the richest country in the world at this time. And what is our responsibilities as the richest country in the world in dealing with aid to other countries? And we hand out money rather quickly to other organizations in other countries to help them deal with it. If you remember the Haiti earthquake in 2010, and where it was over $1 billion that the U.S. had invested in Haiti to rebuild and restructure their organization. How do we deal with, I talked about just a minute ago, the influx of immigrants to the border, the southern border of the United States that's been taking place for the last couple of years, that's been in the news. Where do we go call Mexico and say, hey, how do we stop this influx of people? How can we make Central America better? Do we get involved politically in dealing with the leadership in Brazil and Honduras and some of those Central American countries to help deal with it prior to it coming to our southern border? We know we can't handle in this country the hundreds of thousands and millions of people that want to flee to the greatest country in the world. How do we do that? Politically, it's been a mess at the border. Do we turn them around prior? Do we allow so many in because of persecution? Do we send them back to where they're going to get killed? Those are all things that we deal with. We've talked almost this whole semester about natural disasters, but we also deal with man-made disasters. So if you think about, as I said in the beginning, what we talked about from a country standpoint, now we deal with it globally. We're not having a massive immigration issue on the northern border of Canada. In fact, they've shut the border down since the beginning of the pandemic. And they've been very successful at shutting down the United States personnel coming into Canada, not to spread the COVID-19 vaccination. So they just simply shut down the border to not allow people to come into this country. I go to Canada every year on vacation, but the last 2 years we're unable to get across to the border just to fish. So how is that having an economic impact on Canada? Imagine over 80% of Canada's GDP is tourism. There has been no tourism in Canada in 2 years. How has that affected them economically? Are they able to help other countries at the United Nations when they're having trouble supporting themselves? And how are they going to rebuild from this pandemic? When are they going to start opening up businesses and residences and start dealing with trade and allowing visitors in for recreational purposes? A very, very large portion, I think it's close to 90% of Canada live within 100 miles of the United States border. So if you look across Canada within 100 miles, it is a vast portion of their population. So they deal with the United States quite frequently, and they've been a very good friend of ours. So how do we deal with it when we're having economic issues? And Canada is having serious issues economically, to rebuild their country. So we've had economic issues not only in the United States, but the entire world. So it's going to be interesting to see over the next 6 months to a year as we start to open up here in the United States and we open up around the world economically. How do we get people back to work? And that's one of the biggest issues. I just heard today that the price of fuel's gone up because of not only that man-made issue with the pipeline that comes to the Northeast. We're unable to get truck drivers, to come back to work to run fuel back and forth. And from what I heard, they're paying truckers a large amount of money just to come back to work, just to get the fuel to the Northeast. And that's costing us at the pumps. And we see gas prices going up. So, how do we deal with those issues? You're going to see in the next 6 months to a year. You're in a unique position to where we've had, small disasters here, small disasters there, but now you're going to see how we, when I say we, the world deals with this pandemic. And as the vaccine gets out to other countries around the world, and I heard Canada wasn't going to open up until 75% of Canada is vaccinated. That's a large portion of the population that they're going to have to get vaccinations out to 75% of their population, which is about where we want to be as we start to open up. So it'll be interesting to see. As you read through the chapter and complete your coursework, you'll get a better understanding of the transition back to what we call normalcy. So we'll see what happens. That's chapter 8 in a nutshell. I tried to keep it short and sweet. I went through it rather quickly. If you have any questions, read through it, and as you do your homework, it'll make more sense to you. Have a great week, and we're on week 8. We have 3 weeks to go. Week 10, your research paper is due, so get ready to post that online and send me a copy as well. There'll be more to follow, but you only have a couple weeks to get your research paper done, so get to work on that, and if you have any questions, shoot me an email. Have a great week.